Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel where we bring you face to face with figures from the past and talk about their history. Today, we're talking about Henry VIII's fourth wife, Anne of Cleves. But this isn't just a story about a blind date gone wrong. It's a story of international politics, religious turmoil, and one of the biggest diplomatic blunders in English history. So the question is, was this marriage just another chapter in Henry's chaotic love life? Or was it a desperate political gamble to save England from being wiped off the map? So let's go ahead and get started. In October of 1537, it seemed like Henry VIII had finally gotten everything he ever wanted. His third wife, Jane Seymour, had given birth to a healthy baby boy, the future King Edward VI. But this moment of triumph quickly turned to tragedy. Just 12 days later, Jane was dead from complications of childbirth. Henry was genuinely heartbroken. He considered Jane his one true wife and would later ask to be buried beside her. But beyond the personal grief, her death created a huge political problem. The king was single again, and the succession, while secure for now, rested on the life of one small boy. At the same time, the political situation in Europe was shifting in a very dangerous way for England. For years, England had survived by playing the two great Catholic superpowers, France and the Holy Roman Empire, against each other. As long as King Francis I and Emperor Charles V were at war, little Protestant England was safe. But in the summer of 1538, the unthinkable happened. The two rivals made peace. Suddenly, England was all alone. It's hard to overstate how vulnerable this made them. Henry had broken with the Catholic Church, and the Pope was calling for a holy war against him. Now, with France and the Empire united, that threat felt terrifyingly real. For Henry's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, it must have felt like the walls were closing in. Cromwell, the architect of the English Reformation, knew they needed allies, and fast. If the Catholic powers were united against them, there was only one place to look: the Protestant princes of Germany. An alliance, cemented by a royal marriage, could create a Protestant bloc strong enough to stand against the might of France and the Empire. And so, the search for Henry's fourth queen began. But this was never really about finding a new love for the king. It was about survival. So, Cromwell's eyes turned to Germany, and specifically to a group called the Schmalkaldic League. This was basically a defensive alliance of German princes and cities that had adopted Lutheranism and banded together for protection against the Holy Roman Emperor. For Cromwell, they were the obvious choice for an anti-Catholic, anti-French alliance. But there was a huge problem, and that problem was Henry himself. While Henry had broken with the Pope, he was absolutely not a Protestant in the Lutheran sense. He had created his own unique brand of faith, Catholicism without a Pope. He still believed in the Catholic Mass, in confession, and in clerical celibacy. He saw himself as a true defender of the faith, just not a faith that answered to Rome. In fact, at the very same time Cromwell was trying to negotiate a Protestant alliance, Henry was actively persecuting and even burning Lutherans as heretics in England. For Cromwell, this must have been a diplomatic tightrope walk of epic proportions. He needed an alliance with the Protestants, but his king hated their core beliefs. A marriage to a princess from a deeply Lutheran court was a massive risk. She would bring her own household, her own chaplains, and her own religious customs, potentially pushing England in a direction Henry would never accept. And this is where a small but powerful German state came into play: the Duchy of Cleves. Cleves was in a perfect position. It was strategically important, controlling territory on the lower Rhine River, but more importantly, it was religiously moderate. The Duke William was a reformer and sympathetic to the Protestant cause, but he hadn't officially joined the Schmalkaldic League. He was walking the same middle path as Henry, somewhere between traditional Catholicism and the new Lutheranism. This made a bride from Cleves the perfect compromise. She wouldn't be a Catholic, which was politically impossible, but she also wouldn't be a radical Protestant who would cause religious friction at the English court. She was, in Cromwell's mind, the safest possible bet. And luckily for him, the Duke of Cleves had an unmarried sister. Her name was Anne. But finding a bride for Henry VIII was never going to be easy. This wasn't the handsome, athletic prince who had charmed Catherine of Aragon and dazzled Anne Boleyn. This was a king in his late 40s, massively overweight and plagued by a painful, festering wound on his leg that left him in a near-constant state of irritation. But in his own mind, he was still God's chosen king, and he demanded a wife who was both a political asset and a physical masterpiece. He wanted a woman who would stun the court with her beauty and secure his kingdom with her connections. It was an almost impossible set of criteria. So, Cromwell set his agents to work, creating what was essentially a 16th century international matchmaking service. Ambassadors were instructed to send detailed reports on the appearances of eligible princesses, and the court's master painter, Hans Holbein the Younger, was dispatched to capture their likenesses. The first and most obvious place to look was the French court. An alliance with France was always a possibility, and King Francis the Fine had several female relatives available. But Henry, in his arrogance, made an outrageous demand. He insisted that the ladies be brought to the English settlement at Calais so he could line them up and pick his favourite. The French ambassador was, quite rightly, appalled. He famously replied that it was not the custom in France to trot out ladies of noble birth as if they were horses at a market. The message was clear. The search continued. For a while, Henry was very interested in Christina of Denmark. The recently widowed niece of Emperor Charles V Holbein's portrait of her is one of his masterpieces, and by all accounts, Henry was smitten. But Christina was a devout Catholic and fiercely intelligent. When told of Henry's interest, she supposedly joked that if she had two heads, she would gladly place one at the King of England's disposal. The match fell through. And so, with options dwindling and the threat from France and the Empire growing every day, Cromwell's gaze returned to the one place he felt was safe, the Duchy of Cleves. The Duke had two unmarried sisters, Anne and her younger sister, Amalia. Once again, Hans Holbein was sent on a mission, this time to paint both of them. This was absolutely critical. Because of the conservative customs of the German court, the sisters were kept in relative seclusion. This portrait would be the only thing Henry had to go on. By all accounts, Holbein's portrait of Anne was incredibly flattering. It showed a demure, pretty young woman whose face was partially obscured by her traditional German headdress. For Henry, who was obsessed with appearances, this was crucial. And for Cromwell, who was obsessed with the German alliance, it was the final piece of the puzzle. The marriage treaty was signed. A beautiful portrait was on its way to England, and a German princess was preparing to meet her new husband. It all seemed perfect. But while the politics of the match seemed perfect on paper, a royal marriage is about more than just treaties and alliances. It's about people, and the world that had shaped Anne of Cleves was a world away from the one she was about to enter. The court of her brother, Duke William of Cleves, was nothing like the glittering, sophisticated, and often scandalous court of Henry VIII. It was small, provincial, and deeply conservative. Life there was serious and pious, with none of the music, dancing, and flirtatious games of courtly love that were the lifeblood of the English royal household. Anne and her sister Amalia had been raised by their mother in a very sheltered, almost repressive environment. Their education had focused entirely on preparing them for a quiet domestic life. By all accounts, Anne was an exceptionally talented needlewoman. Her skills with a needle and thread were famous. But she had none of the accomplishments that Henry's court would have expected from a queen. She couldn't sing. She couldn't play a musical instrument. She couldn't dance in the elaborate French style that was popular in England. And perhaps most critically, she spoke only German. She knew no French, the international language of diplomacy and romance, and certainly no English. This wasn't Anne's fault, of course. In the serious world of Cleves, she was the model of a perfect noblewoman, trained to be modest, virtuous, and obedient. But the skills that made her an ideal German duchess made her completely unprepared for the role of an English queen. Unfortunately, Henry VIII wasn't looking for a quiet, modest housewife. He was expecting a dazzling Renaissance princess, a woman who could match the glamour of the French and Spanish courts, a woman who could charm him with her wit and entertain him with her talents. And so, as Anne of Cleves began her long journey to England, two completely different worlds were set on a collision course. The English were expecting the woman from Holbein's beautiful portrait. They had no idea who was really on her way. And the English court was the polar opposite of the quiet, pious world Anne was leaving behind. The court of Henry VIII was a glittering, sophisticated, and deeply competitive place. It was a world that ran on performance. Music, poetry, and dancing weren't just pleasant pastimes. They were the tools of ambition, the language of power. This was a court where your ability to make a witty remark, to engage in a flirtatious game of courtly love, or to compose a clever verse could win you the king's favour. It was a highly sexualized atmosphere, full of double meanings and unspoken rules. To succeed here, you had to be a player in this elaborate game. And Anne knew none of the rules. Her entire life had prepared her to be a virtuous and obedient wife, not a dazzling courtier. She couldn't hold a conversation in French, the language of romance and diplomacy. She couldn't play the lute or the virginals to entertain the king. She couldn't dance the complex galliards and pavans that were the heart of every court celebration. It's hard to really grasp just how isolating this would have been. She was being dropped into a viper's nest of ambition and intrigue, unable to understand the jokes, the flirtations, or the political maneuvering happening all around her. And this wasn't just about impressing the courtiers. This was about impressing Henry. He prided himself on being a true Renaissance prince. He composed music, he wrote poetry, he loved to dance and show off. He expected his queen to be a partner in this cultural display, a reflection of his own sophistication. Henry was expecting a star. What he was about to get was a stranger. So, for Thomas Cromwell, the stakes could not have been higher. The alliance with Cleves was his master plan to save England. It was the only move left on the chessboard. But he knew his king. He knew that all the brilliant political strategy in the world wouldn't matter if Henry didn't find the bride beautiful. And that meant everything, absolutely everything, now rested on the shoulders of one man, the court painter, Hans Holbein, the younger. Now, Holbein was the best in the business. He was a master artist, one of the greatest portrait painters of the entire Renaissance. But this job was about so much more than just art. When Cromwell sent him to the town of Duren to paint the Duke's sisters, he wasn't just being sent to capture a likeness, he was being sent to secure an alliance. It's hard to imagine the pressure he must have been under. Cromwell, his patron, and the most powerful man in England besides the king, was essentially telling him, "Don't mess this up." He needed Holbein to bring back not just a painting, but a guarantee. A promise on canvas that Anne of Cleves was beautiful enough for a king who still saw himself as the handsome prince of his youth. His job wasn't just to be accurate, it was to be persuasive. He had to paint a queen. The fate of the kingdom could very well rest on his brushstrokes. And so, Holbein set to work. The portrait he sent back of Anne was everything Cromwell could have hoped for. It showed a delicate, demure, and pretty young woman, her face partially framed by her traditional German headdress, which conveniently hid her features just enough to add a little mystery. It was flattering, but believable. For Henry, seeing the portrait, it was enough. The deal was on. The portrait Holbein created is one of his most famous miniatures, painted on vellum and set in a stunning ivory case carved to look like a Tudor rose. It was designed to be held in the hand, a private, intimate object for the king to gaze at and fall in love with. But creating this little masterpiece was anything but a relaxed artistic process. Holbein was on a tight schedule. He likely only had 1 or 2 very brief sittings with Anne and her sister. He didn't have the luxury of time to truly study his subject, to capture every nuance of her personality or appearance from every angle. He had to work fast, and he had to get it right on the first try. And this is where we have to talk about artistic interpretation, or maybe political necessity. Holbein was a genius, but he was also an employee. He knew that his patron, Thomas Cromwell, was desperate for this match to succeed. He knew the king was notoriously picky and vain. His job wasn't just to paint what he saw. His job was to sell a queen to a king. For me, the portrait is a masterclass in persuasive art. He presents Anne facing forward, which was unusual, and gives the portrait a very direct, engaging quality. But he also keeps her in her heavy German headdress, which, as we mentioned, conveniently obscures her hairline and the shape of her face. It adds an air of mystery, but it also hides features that might not have been fashionable at the English court. I don't think Holbein was necessarily being dishonest. He was an artist, and his job was to create the most pleasing version of reality. He likely focused on Anne's delicate skin and gentle expression, emphasizing her youth and modesty. He wasn't painting a photograph. He was painting an ideal. The ideal of a demure, beautiful, and royal bride, perfectly suited for the King of England. And it worked. Perfectly. The portrait was a triumph of art and diplomacy. When Henry saw it, he was enchanted. He called the reports of her beauty greatly to our contentation. The deal was sealed, the wedding plans were rushed forward, and the alliance was secure. But a painting is not a person. And when that little portrait arrived in London, it had exactly the effect Cromwell had prayed for, and Holbein had intended. Henry VIII, a man who had grown lonely, bitter, and deeply insecure about his own aging appearance, was completely and utterly captivated. He would have held the small ivory case in his hands, gazing at the face of the young woman who promised to be his new beginning. For Henry, this wasn't just a painting. It was a fantasy. In the delicate brushstrokes, he must have seen not just a pretty face, but the answer to all his anxieties. Here was a beautiful, modest, and royal bride, a woman who would adore him, give him more sons, and prove to the world that he was still the great and desirable king of his youth. He projected all his romantic hopes onto that painted vellum. He wasn't looking at a stranger from a foreign land with a different language and different customs. He was looking at the perfect queen he had constructed in his own mind, a woman whose personality he had already written, whose voice he had already imagined. He was in love with the picture. This infatuation swept away any remaining caution. Any lingering doubts about the religious differences or reports of Anne's sheltered upbringing were forgotten. The king was happy, and when the king was happy, things moved fast. The marriage treaty was finalized with breathtaking speed, based almost entirely on the evidence of this one masterfully persuasive image. All that was left was for the king to meet his bride in person, and Henry, gazing at the perfect face in the ivory case, could not wait. And so, in the late autumn of 1539, the journey began. This wasn't just a princess travelling to her wedding. This was a full-blown state procession, a massive logistical undertaking designed to move a future queen and her entire world from one country to another. The plan was for Anne to travel overland to the English-held port of Calais and from there sail to England. The journey was long and difficult, made worse by the onset of winter. The enormous train of people and wagons moved slowly through the muddy, frozen roads of Europe. Anne was accompanied by a massive retinue of over 260 attendants and 228 horses, a sea of German courtiers who were there to ensure their princess was delivered safely and with all the dignity her rank required. But this is where the first signs of a culture clash began to appear. The English lords who were sent to meet her on the continent were expecting a party. Royal journeys were supposed to be filled with feasting, music, and celebration. But the court of Cleves was not a court of celebration. It was a court of serious, pious duty. Anne's German attendants practiced a rigid, formal, and almost unsmiling etiquette that was completely foreign to the English. They were quiet, reserved, and by all accounts, incredibly dull. The English, used to the boisterous, flirtatious, and noisy court of Henry VIII, were baffled. It must have been deeply confusing for them. They had come to welcome a new queen, but the atmosphere felt more like a funeral procession. And for Anne herself, it must have been a strange and lonely experience. She was leaving her home, her family, and everything she had ever known, surrounded by the familiar, solemn faces of her own people. She had no idea that the very culture that was her only comfort was already marking her out as an outsider. The two worlds were not mixing well. Finally, after weeks of travel, Anne and her solemn German court arrived at Calais, where they were delayed for another 15 days by bad weather. But on December 27th, 1539, she at last set foot on English soil at the town of Deal. She was now in England, and the king, impatient and giddy with excitement, was already on his way to surprise her. As Anne and her entourage made their way from the coast through the English countryside, the sense of unease among the English diplomats only grew. The man in charge of her reception was the Earl of Southampton, and he was in an impossible position. He and the other English lords had spent the last 15 days with Anne, waiting for the weather to clear in Calais. And in that time, a very worrying reality had begun to sink in. They had tried, of course, to get to know their future queen. They would approach her and speak to her in French, the international language of the court. She would just smile and nod politely. They would try again, this time in English, hoping she had picked up a few phrases. Again, just a quiet, pleasant smile. The woman who was supposed to become the centre of their glittering, talkative court couldn't hold a conversation. It must have been incredibly isolating for Anne. She was surrounded by these powerful, richly dressed men, all staring at her, all trying to speak to her, and she couldn't understand a word. Her only comfort was her small circle of German ladies in waiting, who she would turn to for translation. But to the English, this just made her seem even more remote and aloof. For Southampton, this was a diplomatic nightmare. He had to send regular updates to the king, who was waiting impatiently in London, giddy with excitement. How do you tell a man like Henry VIII that his beautiful new bride, the woman from the portrait, was lovely to look at, but had none of the social graces he expected? How do you explain that she couldn't flirt, or tell a joke, or even ask for a glass of wine in a language he understood? To pass the long, awkward evenings, the English tried to teach her card games. It was a desperate attempt to find some kind of common ground, and by all accounts, Anne was a very quick learner. She picked up a popular game called Scent with ease, and her quiet intelligence was obvious. But it wasn't enough. The reports sent back to Cromwell and the king were masterpieces of diplomatic spin. They praised her princely manners and her quick mind, carefully dancing around the fact that she was, for all intents and purposes, silent. They were all just hoping that her beauty would be enough to win Henry over, and that the language and the charm would come later. But the king was not a patient man, and he had no idea about the whispered concerns or the awkward silent evenings. He only knew what the portrait had promised him, and he was on his way to claim it. And it wasn't just her silence that was causing concern, it was also how she looked. Not her face, which everyone agreed was pleasant enough, but her clothes. Fashion in the 16th century wasn't just about personal taste, it was a powerful statement of culture, status, and morality. And Anne's clothes were speaking a language the English court found deeply foreign. She and her ladies were dressed in the high German style. This meant layers of heavy, dark fabrics like velvet and wool, with high necklines that came right up to the chin. The silhouettes were bulky and concealing, designed to completely hide the female form. And most strikingly, they wore enormous, elaborate headdresses with heavy veils that shrouded their faces and hair. Everything was designed to communicate modesty, piety, and seriousness. For Anne, of course, this was completely normal. This was the fashion of a respectable, noble woman from a devout and serious court. It was a visual symbol of her virtue. But the English court, and especially Henry's court, had a very different idea of style. The height of fashion in England was the French hood. Popularized by Henry's second wife, Anne Boleyn, the French hood was small, elegant, and alluring. It was a crescent-shaped cap worn far back on the head, deliberately designed to show off a woman's hair, which would be parted in the middle. It framed the face rather than hiding it. It was sophisticated, a little bit daring, and it spoke of the witty, flirtatious world of the French court. So you have this incredible contrast. The German fashion was all about hiding the woman, wrapping her in layers of piety. The English fashion was about showcasing the woman, highlighting her features and her personality. It was another wall of misunderstanding being built between them, brick by brick. The English courtiers, used to the glamour and flirtation of the French style, must have looked at Anne's severe, heavy gowns and seen someone who was not just foreign, but old-fashioned and dull. And for a king as vain and fashion-conscious as Henry, this was a disaster. He was expecting a dazzling European princess. What he was getting was a woman who, in the eyes of his court, looked more like a nun. Finally, on December 27, 1539, after 15 long days of waiting for the winter storms to pass, Anne of Cleves stepped onto English soil. The crossing from Calais had been rough, and she arrived at the coastal town of Deal, no doubt exhausted and probably seasick. But there was no time for rest. A huge crowd of English nobles and ladies had gathered to welcome her, a sea of unfamiliar faces all straining to get their first look at the new queen. It's hard to even imagine how overwhelming this must have been for her. She was in a new country, surrounded by the noise of a language she didn't understand, and every single eye was on her. For weeks, the English court had been buzzing with rumours about her beauty, all based on Holbein's flattering portrait. The anticipation was immense. They were expecting a star. And so, as she walked from the ship, the scrutiny was immediate and intense. The welcoming party would have seen a young woman with a pleasant, gentle face, just as the portrait had promised, but they would have also seen the reality that the painting had so cleverly hidden. They saw the heavy, dark, German gowns that looked so foreign and severe compared to the elegant French styles of their own court. They saw a woman who seemed shy and reserved, offering quiet smiles instead of the witty greetings they expected. The whispers must have started almost immediately. This was the woman the king was so excited to meet. She was nice enough, certainly, but she wasn't the dazzling beauty from the stories. She wasn't the glamorous Renaissance princess they had been promised. The fantasy was beginning to crumble. But the official welcome had to go on. Anne was formally greeted, ushered into a carriage, and began her slow, grand procession towards London. The first impression had been made, and for many, it was one of quiet disappointment. And all the while, the king, still madly in love with a painting, was riding to meet her, completely unaware that the woman he was about to see was not the woman he had imagined. But the king, who was now at Greenwich Palace, just couldn't wait any longer. He was giddy with anticipation, still completely under the spell of Holbein's perfect little portrait. The formal planned reception at Blackheath was still days away, and for a man as impatient and romantic as Henry, that felt like an eternity. He had to see her, now. And so, in a fit of what he must have seen as romantic genius, he decided he wouldn't wait for the stuffy official meeting. He would ride to Rochester, where Anne was resting for the night, and surprise her. And to make it even more special, he would go in disguise. Now, this wasn't as strange as it might sound to us. It was part of a popular courtly game, a kind of chivalric play acting called mumming. The idea was that a man would arrive disguised, and the lady, through her keen intuition and the power of their special connection, was supposed to see through the disguise and recognize her true love. It was a flirtatious, charming test of a woman's courtly grace. For Henry, this was the height of romance. He was casting himself as the hero in a storybook, the handsome prince arriving to test his lady's love. He was about to give Anne a chance to show off her sophistication and prove she was the perfect queen for his glittering court. But it was a test she was guaranteed to fail. She had been raised in a world without these games. She didn't speak the language. She had no idea what the king, a man she'd only ever seen in a tiny painting, even looked like. She had been trained to be modest and reserved, not to play flirtatious guessing games with strange men who burst into her rooms. It was a recipe for absolute disaster. So on New Year's Day, 1540, Henry and a few of his most trusted gentlemen of the Privy Chamber rode to Rochester. They were disguised in simple, rough-looking cloaks, looking for all the world like a group of the king's messengers. Henry was practically buzzing with excitement. This was the moment he had been dreaming of, the culmination of his romantic fantasy. Anne was in her chambers, likely watching the New Year's festivities in the courtyard below. She was waiting for the king, but she was expecting a grand, formal arrival, not a prank. For Anne, it must have been a moment of pure confusion when the door to her room suddenly burst open and a large, older man in a servant's cloak strode in, followed by a few others. He was loud, boisterous, and acting with a familiarity that was completely inappropriate for his station. This was it. For Henry, this was the moment of truth. He presented Anne with a New Year's gift, supposedly from the king. He was waiting for her to look into his eyes, to see past the disguise, and to recognize the soul of her beloved, the king himself. He was expecting a gasp, a blush, a knowing smile. He was expecting the magic of courtly love to work. But that's not what happened. Anne, who had never seen the king before and had no concept of these strange English games, saw only a rude middle-aged messenger who was behaving far too forwardly. She was polite, but distant. She accepted the gift, gave a brief word of thanks, and then, in a move that must have horrified every English person in the room, she turned her back on him and went back to looking out the window. The King of England was being ignored. The romantic hero of the story was being treated like the servant he was dressed as. In the excruciating silence that followed, you could almost hear Henry's entire fantasy world crashing down around him. This was not how the story was supposed to go. But let's stop and look at this exact same moment, but from Anne's point of view. It's hard to imagine how utterly confusing and frightening this must have been for her. She was in a foreign country, in a room full of strangers, waiting to formally meet her future husband. She was likely looking out the window at the New Year's festivities, perhaps watching a bull baiting in the courtyard below, when the door to her private chambers suddenly burst open. In strode a group of men dressed as common messengers, and one of them, a large, heavy-set man with a greying beard, was behaving with a shocking lack of decorum. He was loud, he was overly familiar, and he was staring at her in a way that must have felt deeply inappropriate. He presented her with a gift, saying it was from the king. Anne had no way of knowing this was a game. In the world she came from, a servant would never, ever behave this way in the presence of royalty. She saw a rude, presumptuous messenger who was overstepping his bounds in a major way. So she did exactly what she had been trained to do her entire life. She was polite, but she was firm. She accepted the gift with a brief word of thanks, and then she turned her back on him, returning her attention to the scene outside the window. It was a clear, non-verbal dismissal. For the English courtiers in the room, it was a moment of pure horror. The king had just been snubbed. The humiliation was total. Henry, his romantic fantasy shattered, left the room in a state of fury. A few moments later, he returned, this time dressed in the magnificent clothes of a king. The second meeting was stiff, formal, and excruciatingly awkward. But it was too late. The first impression, the one that truly mattered, had already been made. The damage was done. For Henry, the humiliation was absolute. He had staged this grand romantic gesture, casting himself as the hero in a chivalric tale, and he had been utterly and completely dismissed. He stormed out of the room, his face a mask of fury. The man who had just been ignored was not some lowly messenger. He was the King of England, and he had just been made to look like a fool in front of his own men. A few agonizingly long minutes later, the door opened again. But this time, the man who entered was not a boisterous messenger in a rough cloak. It was Henry VIII, dressed in a magnificent coat of purple velvet, dripping with jewels and gold. The game was over. This was the king. The formal introduction that followed must have been one of the most excruciatingly awkward scenes in Tudor history. There were stiff bows and stilted greetings, all passed through a nervous translator. The easy, flirtatious atmosphere Henry had tried to create was gone, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. It's hard to imagine the dawning horror Anne must have felt. The rude, overly familiar messenger was the king himself. She had just snubbed the man she was supposed to marry, the most powerful man in her new country. She had failed a test she didn't even know she was taking. She must have been terrified, confused, and utterly mortified, with no way to explain that she had simply been acting with the modesty her mother had taught her. But for Henry, the problem was so much deeper than just his wounded pride. As he stood there, making awkward translated small talk, he was finally seeing the real Anne of Cleves for the first time. And she was nothing like the woman in the portrait. The fantasy he had fallen in love with, the charming, sophisticated princess from the painting, simply wasn't there. In her place was a shy, quiet stranger who couldn't understand a word he said. There was no spark, there was no chemistry, there was no connection. The marriage was dead on arrival. Henry could not get out of Rochester fast enough. The man who had arrived giddy with romantic excitement just hours before was now a storm cloud of silent fury. The journey back to his palace at Greenwich was the complete opposite of the hopeful ride out. He retreated to his royal barge, refusing to speak to anyone, stewing in his own public and private humiliation. It's hard to imagine a more miserable New Year's Day. As the barge cut through the cold water of the Thames, Henry was trapped with his thoughts. He had been made to look like a fool. He had been snubbed by a woman he was supposed to marry, a woman who, in his eyes, was nothing like the beauty he had been promised. The fantasy was not just broken, it had been shattered into a million pieces. The moment he arrived back at Greenwich, he sent for Thomas Cromwell. The chief minister, the architect of the entire marriage, likely arrived expecting to hear the king's happy report. Instead, he walked into a tempest. And it was then that Henry finally exploded. "I like her not! I like her not!" he raged. He felt utterly deceived. He blamed Cromwell. He blamed his ambassadors. He blamed the painter Holbein. He furiously declared that Cromwell had bound him for life to a great Flanders mare. For Henry, this wasn't just about a lack of attraction. It was a deep, personal insult to his own ego and his royal majesty. He felt he had been tricked, sold a bill of goods based on a flattering portrait and false reports. In his mind, this was a conspiracy against him, and Cromwell was the man responsible. The damage was done. For Thomas Cromwell, the king's rage was more than just a tantrum. It was the sound of his own world collapsing. This marriage, this German alliance, was his masterpiece. It was the culmination of years of careful, dangerous political manoeuvring. It was meant to be the move that secured England, secured the Reformation, and secured his own place at the king's right hand. And now it was all about to be destroyed. Not by a foreign invasion or a Catholic plot, but because the king didn't like the bride's dress and had been snubbed during a childish game. It must have been a moment of pure, cold terror. Cromwell knew Henry better than anyone. He knew that when the king felt humiliated, he needed someone to blame. And Cromwell was the man who had brought him this Flanders mare. His life now hung by the thinnest of threads. The king's demand was simple and brutal. Get me out of this. He did not want to go through with the wedding. He wanted the treaty broken, the woman sent home, and the whole embarrassing episode erased. And so began a desperate, frantic scramble. Cromwell summoned the king's councillors and lawyers. They were in an impossible position. A legally binding marriage treaty had been signed. The future queen was already on English soil, just days away from her wedding. To break the treaty now would be a catastrophic insult to the Duke of Cleves and the entire Schmalkaldic League. It would leave England utterly isolated and exposed. They pored over the treaty, searching for any mistake, any ambiguity, any tiny crack they could use to pry the whole thing open. For days, they found nothing. The treaty was ironclad. And then they found it. A possible way out. A legal technicality that had been discussed and dismissed months ago, but which now looked like a lifeline. The pre-contract. Before the English match was ever proposed, Anne had been formally betrothed to Francis, the son of the Duke of Lorraine. While that betrothal had been set aside, the English lawyers now seized on the fact that a formal document of release had never been issued. They could, in theory, argue that Anne was not truly free to marry Henry, because she was still technically promised to another. It was a very, very weak argument. Everyone knew the betrothal was defunct. But for Cromwell, clinging to his political life, it was something. It was a sliver of hope. The wedding was just 6 days away. And so, with this flimsy legal argument as their only weapon, the king's counsellors were dispatched to Rochester to interrogate Anne. It's hard to imagine the pressure they were under. They had been given an impossible task by a terrified Thomas Cromwell: get the future queen to admit that she wasn't actually free to marry the king. They needed her to give them the ammunition to blow up her own wedding. For Anne, it must have been utterly bewildering. Just a day after the disastrous New Year's meeting, a group of the most powerful men in England, the same men who had been bowing and smiling at her, suddenly appeared in her rooms. Their faces were grim. Their questions, passed through a nervous translator, were sharp and confusing. They were asking about Francis of Lorraine, a boy she had been betrothed to as a child. She had no idea what was happening. Why were they so obsessed with this old, broken arrangement? She was just days away from becoming the Queen of England, and the King's own council was treating her like a criminal under investigation. She must have been terrified, thinking she had done something terribly wrong, but with no way of knowing what it was. Anne, being the honest and straightforward person she was, answered their questions truthfully. Yes, she had been betrothed to Francis when they were both children, but, she insisted, that betrothal had been formally dissolved years ago under canon law. She was a free woman, and she had the documents back in Cleves to prove it. She was trying to be helpful, to clear up what she thought was a simple misunderstanding. But her honest, clear answers were the worst possible thing she could have said. The counsellors weren't looking for the truth. They were looking for ambiguity, for a confession they could twist into a legal loophole. By calmly and rationally explaining that the pre-contract was null and void, Anne had just single-handedly destroyed their entire strategy. The legal escape route had just been slammed shut. With the pre-contract escape route now gone, Thomas Cromwell was completely out of options. The legal loophole had been a desperate long shot, and it had failed. Now, he and the council had to go back to the king with the worst possible news. Not only was there no legal way out of the marriage, there was no political way out either. It must have been one of the most difficult conversations of Cromwell's life. He had to explain to the most powerful man in England that he was, in fact, powerless. To send Anne home now, after she had already arrived on English soil for her wedding, would be a catastrophic public insult to her brother, the Duke of Cleves. And a humiliated duke would not remain England's ally for long. He would immediately turn to the powers England feared most, France and the Holy Roman Empire. The Protestant alliance Cromwell had worked so hard to build would shatter. Instead of an ally, England would have created another enemy, one who would be all too happy to join the Catholic crusade against them. Suddenly, the full weight of the situation must have crashed down on Henry. For a man who was used to getting everything he wanted, it must have felt like the walls were closing in. This wasn't just about his own wounded pride anymore. It was about the survival of his kingdom. Rejecting Anne wouldn't just be a personal decision, it would be an act of war. A war that, with France and the Empire united against them, England had absolutely no chance of winning. He was trapped. The wedding would have to go ahead. And so, the morning of January 6th, 1540 arrived, the day of the royal wedding. But there was no joy at Greenwich Palace. There were no sounds of happy celebration, no excited courtiers rushing through the halls. The atmosphere was thick with tension, as grim and silent as a tomb. For Henry, it must have felt less like his wedding day, and more like the day of his execution. He was a king who had bent the world to his will, and now he was a prisoner of his own politics. He was sullen, furious, and utterly trapped. He had to go through with this, not for love or even for companionship, but for the cold, hard survival of his kingdom. The robing ceremony began. Attendants brought out the magnificent wedding clothes, a costume of breathtaking splendor designed to project the image of a powerful and happy king. As they dressed him in layers of velvet and cloth of gold, encasing him in jewels, Henry stood there like a statue, his face a mask of cold fury. And it was then, as he was being transformed into the very picture of a joyous bridegroom, that he turned to his ministers and muttered one of the most bitter and revealing lines of his entire reign. "If it were not to satisfy the world and my realm, I would not do that I must do this day." This was not a marriage, it was a sacrifice. And across the palace, Anne of Cleves was also being dressed for her wedding day. She was likely nervous, perhaps even a little hopeful, but completely unaware that her future husband was walking towards the altar like a man walking to the gallows. And so, the procession made its way to the Queen's closet at Greenwich Palace for the wedding ceremony. By all accounts, the room was filled with the highest-ranking nobles of the land, all dressed in their finest, all there to witness the union that would supposedly save England. The visual spectacle was one of power and wealth, but the mood was anything but celebratory. Anne was the very picture of a royal bride. She wore a gown of rich cloth of gold, made in the German style, but it was her hair that would have caught everyone's attention. It was worn loose, flowing down her back, crowned with a coronet of pearl. This wasn't just a hairstyle, it was a powerful and traditional symbol of virginity, a public declaration of her purity for the king. For Anne, this must have been a moment of overwhelming nerves, but also of hope. She was doing her duty. She was becoming a queen. And then there was Henry. He was the sullen counterpoint to his radiant, if foreign-looking, bride. The man who had just declared this was a sacrifice he was making for his realm now had to play the part of the happy bridegroom. He stood stiffly beside Anne, his face grim, barely making eye contact. The vows were exchanged, likely with the help of a translator, adding another layer of cold formality to what should have been an intimate moment. It's heartbreaking to even imagine the scene. The hopeful young woman, publicly declaring her virtue, standing next to a king who could barely contain his disgust. The deed was done. Henry VIII had his fourth wife. The public performance was over, but the private disaster was just about to begin. The public ceremony was over, and now came the most crucial part of any royal wedding: the bedding. This wasn't a private romantic moment. It was a state duty. The entire court, and indeed the entire kingdom, was waiting for the news that the marriage had been consummated, that the path to a new heir was open. After the grim spectacle of the wedding, everyone was holding their breath, hoping that behind closed doors, the king would do his duty. But the night was a disaster. By all accounts, Henry went to the marriage bed, but his heart, and it seems his body, was not in it. He was still trapped in his own fury and humiliation. He saw not a new bride, but the Flanders mare he felt he'd been tricked into marrying. For Anne, it must have been a confusing and perhaps frightening experience. She was alone with this powerful, moody man who barely spoke her language. We don't know exactly what happened in that room, but we know what didn't. The marriage was not consummated. The next morning, Henry's fury exploded. He summoned Thomas Cromwell and gave him a brutally frank and humiliating account of the night. He complained that he could never be stirred to know her carnally. He attacked her appearance, declaring that she was nothing so fair as she had been reported. He made cruel, specific complaints about her body, claiming he had left her as good a maid as I found her. For Henry, a man whose ego was as large as his kingdom, this was an unthinkable failure. But in his mind, the failure could not possibly be his. It had to be hers. He insisted that her appearance and even her supposed evil smells had made it impossible for him to perform his kingly duty. It was a desperate, cruel attempt to shift the blame for his own lack of desire, and perhaps his own physical inability, onto the young woman who was now his wife. and the most heartbreaking part of this whole sad affair. Anne was completely oblivious. The next morning, her ladies-in-waiting asked her if she was still a maid. Anne, who had no real understanding of what was supposed to happen, replied cheerfully, "Why not? When the king comes to bed, he kisses me and takes me by the hand and bids me good night, sweetheart. And in the morning, he kisses me and bids me farewell, darling." She thought this was what it meant to be married. She believed she was now a queen and that she would soon be with child. She had no idea that her husband was already plotting how to get rid of her. And so, the weeks that followed, the wedding settled into a strange and deeply uncomfortable routine. On the surface, Anne was the Queen of England. She had the titles, the palaces, and the jewels. She presided over a court that bowed to her, but in reality, she was a queen in name only, living in a gilded cage. It must have been a profoundly lonely existence. She was surrounded by hundreds of people, but she couldn't speak to almost any of them. The witty banter, the political gossip, the flirtatious games that were the lifeblood of the court, all happened in a language she didn't understand. She would sit through long dinners in silence, smiling politely, while the real life of the court swirled around her, completely out of reach. Her only real companions were her few German ladies-in-waiting, a small, isolated island in a sea of English courtiers. But while Anne was trapped in her lonely silence, Henry was not. He was resentful, bored, and looking for a distraction, and the court, ever watchful of the king's moods, was more than happy to provide one. The powerful Howard family, who had seen one of their own, Anne Boleyn, rise to the throne, were ready to play that game again. They had placed a young, vivacious niece in the new queen's household. Her name was Catherine Howard. She was everything Anne of Cleves was not. She was English, she was flirtatious, she was a skilled dancer, and she was a product of the sophisticated, scandalous world of the Tudor court. While the king publicly ignored his quiet German wife, he was privately becoming more and more enchanted by her young, giggling maid of honor. A new player had entered the game, and Anne, the quiet queen, had absolutely no idea. As the cold winter of 1540 slowly gave way to spring, the royal marriage remained a hollow sham. Publicly, Anne was treated with all the respect due to a queen. But privately, the king's resentment festered. The awkward, silent dinners continued. The separate bedrooms remained the norm. The court, ever watchful, knew the truth. The marriage was a failure. For Henry, the situation was becoming unbearable. His pride was wounded, his romantic fantasy was shattered, and he was bored. He was tired of the charade. He had done his duty for the realm by going through with the wedding, but his patience was at an end. He wanted out. And so, he went back to his lawyers and theologians with a new, more urgent demand: find me a way out. And this time, he wouldn't take no for an answer. The old flimsy argument of the pre-contract with the Duke of Lorraine was dusted off once again. But this time, it wasn't a desperate hope. It was an order. They were to find a way to make it work, to turn this legal molehill into a mountain big enough to hide an annulment behind. But this wasn't just about getting rid of a wife Henry didn't like. For the enemies of Thomas Cromwell, it was the opportunity they had been waiting for. The powerful Duke of Norfolk, uncle to the charming Catherine Howard, saw his chance. The German alliance was a failure. The German Queen was a joke. And the man responsible for it all was Thomas Cromwell. For Cromwell, it must have felt like the walls were closing in from all sides. On one side, he had a furious king demanding an impossible divorce. On the other, he had the entire conservative faction of the court, smelling blood in the water and whispering poison into the king's ear, promoting their own beautiful, vivacious candidate for queen. The architect of the Reformation was about to be torn down by his own creation. The fall was coming. And the ultimate stage for this unfolding personal and political drama would be the Great May Day Joust of 1540. This wasn't just a sporting event, it was a massive public spectacle, a piece of political theatre designed to showcase the power, wealth, and glamour of the Tudor court, and at the very centre of that theatre was the royal family. And so, there in the royal box, sat Queen Anne. By all accounts, she played her part with a quiet dignity that is almost heartbreaking to imagine. She was dressed in the magnificent clothes of a queen. She smiled at the crowds, and she applauded the knights as they charged at each other below. She was doing everything a queen was supposed to do, performing her role perfectly. But Henry wasn't playing his part. He was putting on a different show entirely. His attention wasn't on his wife. It was fixed on her young, vivacious maid of honour, Catherine Howard, who was also in the royal box. In the highly symbolic world of the joust, where knights fought for a lady's favour, the king made it painfully obvious where his favour lay. He was seen openly flirting with Catherine, laughing with her, and dedicating his honours to her for the entire court to see. This wasn't just a private flirtation anymore. This was a public declaration. By openly honouring Catherine instead of his own wife, Henry was sending a clear and brutal message to his court, his people, and to the foreign ambassadors who were watching every move. The German queen was a queen in name only. The king's heart and the court's future belonged to the Howard girl. The public humiliation was complete. The public humiliation at the May Day joust was the final signal. The king had his new favourite in Catherine Howard, and the court knew it. But for Henry, simply ignoring his wife wasn't enough. To get what he truly wanted, an annulment and a new queen, he needed to clear the board. And the biggest piece on that board was the man who had engineered the whole disastrous affair, Thomas Cromwell. And so, on June 10th, 1540, the trap was sprung. Cromwell arrived for what he thought was a routine council meeting at Westminster. He walked into the room, took his seat at the head of the table, and prepared for the day's business. He had no idea that his entire world was about to be torn apart. Suddenly, the captain of the guard entered the room and placed him under arrest for treason. In a moment of high drama, his great rival, the Duke of Norfolk, stepped forward and personally ripped the chains of office from Cromwell's neck. The other councillors, men who had feared him just moments before, now descended on him like a pack of wolves, shouting insults and accusations. For Cromwell, it must have been a moment of pure, shocking disbelief. He famously cried out, "Is this my reward for my service?" The butcher's son from Putney had finally been brought down. For Anne, who would have heard the news shortly after, it must have been terrifying. Thomas Cromwell had been the architect of her marriage, yes, but he was also her only real ally in the English court. He was the one powerful man who had a vested interest in her success. With him gone, arrested and on his way to the Tower, she was now completely and utterly alone, surrounded by men who were loyal only to the king and his new favourite. Her last shield was gone. With Cromwell in the Tower, the final act of the drama played out with brutal speed. The man who had risen from nothing to become the most powerful man in England was now a condemned traitor. He wrote one last, desperate letter to the king, pleading for mercy, but it was no use. On July 28, 1540, Thomas Cromwell was executed on Tower Hill. On the very same day, Henry VIII married his fifth wife, Catherine Howard. The board had been cleared. But what of Anne, the woman at the centre of this political earthquake? With Cromwell gone, she was completely at the mercy of the king and his council. They came to her and informed her that the king, after much soul-searching, had concluded their marriage was invalid. They presented her with the old flimsy argument about the pre-contract, now presented as an undeniable fact. It must have been a moment of pure terror. She was a foreign woman, alone, with no allies. She had seen what happened to queens who displeased Henry. She knew the stories of Catherine of Aragon's lonely exile and Anne Boleyn's execution. She must have thought her life was over. But this is where the story takes a surprising turn. Anne of Cleves, the quiet, sheltered woman who couldn't play the court's games, proved to be one of the shrewdest political survivors of the entire Tudor era. Instead of fighting, instead of protesting, she did something incredibly intelligent. She agreed. She calmly accepted the annulment, graciously testifying that the marriage had never been consummated. In doing so, she gave Henry exactly what he wanted: an easy, clean, and legal way out. And in return for her cooperation, she was rewarded beyond anyone's imagination. She was not sent home in disgrace. Instead, she was given a massive settlement, including several grand houses, including Anne Boleyn's childhood home, a huge income, and a new, unprecedented title: the King's beloved sister. Against all odds, the Flanders mare had won the race. She would outlive Cromwell, Catherine Howard, and even Henry himself, living out her days in England as a wealthy, independent, and respected noblewoman. So what are we to make of the object that started it all? What about that beautiful, persuasive portrait by Hans Holbein? For centuries, people have debated whether Holbein deliberately lied, painting a fantasy to please his patron. Did his flattering brushstrokes lead a king to disaster and a minister to the executioner's block? For me, the portrait is not a lie. It is a masterpiece of political art, created under immense pressure. Holbein's job wasn't to be a camera, it was to sell a queen to a king. He emphasized her best features, her youth, her modesty, and her royal dignity. He created the ideal of a perfect bride, and he did it brilliantly. The tragedy was not in the painting, but in the man who looked at it. Henry VIII didn't fall in love with Anne of Cleves. He fell in love with his own fantasy, a fantasy he projected onto the vellum. He saw a perfect, sophisticated princess who would adore him and reflect his own glory. When the real Anne, a quiet, nervous, and very German young woman, arrived, she could never compete with the woman in his head. The portrait wasn't a failure of art. It was a casualty of a king's ego. And in the end, it remains a stunning, poignant reminder of a marriage that was sealed by a beautiful image and shattered by the harsh light of reality. With Cromwell gone, Anne was defenseless. Her only powerful ally was in the Tower, and the wolves were circling. She was a queen in name only, a foreign woman in a court that now answered to her rival, Catherine Howard. She must have spent those days in a state of quiet dread, waiting for the axe to fall. She didn't have to wait long. Just a few days after Cromwell's arrest, a delegation of the king's councillors arrived to see her. They didn't come with accusations or chains. They came with a message of concern, delivered with cold, formal smiles. There was an outbreak of the sweating sickness in London, they explained. The king, in his great mercy and concern for her health, was ordering her to leave court immediately. She was to move to the clean, fresh air of Richmond Palace. But this wasn't an act of kindness. It was a death sentence for her marriage, and everyone knew it. It was a classic move straight from Henry's playbook, a chilling echo of the past that would have been obvious to everyone at court. This was the exact same strategy he had used to begin the long, painful process of breaking Catherine of Aragon. First, you remove the Queen from court. You isolate her from her friends and supporters. You send her away under a flimsy excuse, and then, once she is alone and powerless, you begin the attack. For Anne, this must have been a moment of pure, cold terror. She had surely heard the stories of Henry's first queen, of her lonely exile and her sad, isolated death. Now, the same pattern was repeating itself. She was being sent into the wilderness, just as the queen before her had been, and she knew how that story had ended. She was being erased. And so, Anne was sent to Richmond Palace, alone and terrified. The king's cruel kindness, sending her away for her health, was a move she was smart enough to understand. She was being isolated. She was being erased. She must have spent those days in a state of quiet dread, walking through the empty palace gardens, waiting for the final blow to fall. She knew the stories. She knew what happened to queens who were no longer wanted. She didn't have to wait long. Soon, a delegation from the King's Council arrived. This was it, the moment of truth. They informed her, with cold, formal politeness, that the king, after much prayer and soul-searching, had concluded that their marriage was invalid. They presented her with the old, flimsy argument about her pre-contract to the Duke of Lorraine, now presented as an undeniable legal fact. They were asking for her agreement to an annulment. It must have been a moment of pure, gut-wrenching terror. She was a foreign woman, alone, with no allies. Her only protector, Thomas Cromwell, was in the Tower, awaiting his own death. She had seen what happened to queens who displeased Henry. She must have thought her life was over. But this is where the story takes its most surprising turn. Anne of Cleves, the quiet, sheltered woman who couldn't play the court's games, proved to be one of the shrewdest political survivors of the entire Tudor era. Instead of fighting, instead of protesting or pleading, she did something incredibly intelligent. She agreed. She calmly accepted the annulment, graciously testifying that the marriage had never been consummated and that she accepted the king's judgment. In doing so, she gave Henry exactly what he wanted, an easy, clean, and legal way out that required no fight and no further humiliation for his fragile ego. And for her cooperation, she was rewarded beyond anyone's imagination. She was not sent home in disgrace. Instead, she was given a massive settlement, including several grand houses, a huge income, and a new unprecedented title, the King's beloved sister. Against all odds, the Flanders mare had won the race. She would outlive Cromwell, Catherine Howard, and even Henry himself, living out her days in England as a wealthy, independent, and respected noblewoman. So, what are we to make of the object that started it all? What about that beautiful, persuasive portrait by Hans Holbein? For centuries, people have debated whether Holbein deliberately lied, painting a fantasy to please his patron. Did his flattering brushstrokes lead a king to disaster and a minister to the executioner's block? For me, the portrait is not a lie. It is a masterpiece of political art, created under immense pressure. Holbein's job wasn't to be a camera, it was to sell a queen to a king. He emphasized her best features, her youth, her modesty, and her royal dignity. He created the ideal of a perfect bride, and he did it brilliantly. The tragedy was not in the painting, but in the man who looked at it. Henry VIII didn't fall in love with Anne of Cleves. He fell in love with his own fantasy, a fantasy he projected onto the vellum. He saw a perfect, sophisticated princess who would adore him and reflect his own glory. When the real Anne, a quiet, nervous, and very German young woman, arrived, she could never compete with the woman in his head. The portrait wasn't a failure of art, it was a casualty of a king's ego. And in the end, it remains a stunning, poignant reminder of a marriage that was sealed by a beautiful image and shattered by the harsh light of reality.